I'm really delighted to be here. I love the Byron Writers Festival. Ever since I came back to Australia 10 years ago, this has been the highlight of the year for me. But I'm even more pleased to be asked to launch David's latest book. I kept questioning him about why he wanted me to launch it, and I still haven't got a satisfactory answer. But I did enjoy reading the book both in draft form and in its, now I'm halfway through reading it again in the completed form. And this is not David's first book. He wrote a book, once again, about what I would have called a fairly obscure fellow who actually turns out to be absolutely fascinating. That's one of the great gifts the writer does, I think, is plucking people out of oblivion and bringing them to our attention again. And in this case, Heresy, David is writing about a chap who's sort of lost in the mists of church history, you know, because he was declared fairly early on to be rather dangerous and was declared to be a heretic, of course, and that's why David's called the book Heresy, whose name I would pronounce as Pelagius, is that right? Yeah. Pelagius, and I want to ask David in a moment, you know, why he would choose another obscure figure to write about. But to me, this festival is not just a festival of writers and readers, it's the festival of ideas. You know, this is what in Adelaide and in Sydney they have a separate festival for, the Festival of Ideas. It's wonderful to me. I get so overstimulated coming here every day and hearing the incredible range of discussions going on in the different marquees. And I wish, rather foolishly, that I could be in more than one place at a time, which has been a problem for me all my life. So I hope that wish doesn't ever get granted. But it is the Festival of Ideas, and that's what struck me on my first read of the book, that this is a book about ideas. And not to frighten anybody off, that doesn't make it a dry read. It's very, very inspiring, and actually it made me start thinking about conditions today, about the contemporary battle of ideas. And, you know, because I'm a sort of late 20th century child of secularism, I wasn't really that interested in ancient church history. I wasn't very interested in modern church either, because I was one of those people that the modern church had already declared to be an abomination and, you know, had been thoroughly marginalised. I'm a religious pariah, so guess how much interest I had in religion. But I've had a guru for 39 years, so what did I do? You know, Carl Jung was right. You know, he had over the lintel of his house in Kusnacht, he has a phrase in Latin: "Vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderit," which means something like, whether invoked or not invoked, the God will be present, or the God will turn up. And Jung said that everyone who came to him in middle age with any kind of psychological crisis was actually undergoing a spiritual crisis, which could lead to a transformation. I suppose today we call it midlife crisis. So what am I raving on about? I'm raving on because I find it really interesting to read about the real struggle in early church history between ideas. And David paints a picture of some early Christian figures as fairly savage people. The book opens with, I'll come on to Hypatia later, but the book opens with a kidnapping. And this is pure fiction, of course. David needed, because Pelagius's information about him is really only retrieved from stories told mostly by his enemies, he's had to recreate the reality of the man and his travels, and he's used a very clever device to do this. It's a really beautifully written book. He's created a kind of secretary figure, a Welsh boy who gets kidnapped early in the book by some very evangelical types, you know, the Nazarenes, David calls the early Christians, who decide that he will be their entree, the Roman entree back into the tribes of Britain and Wales, the Ordovicians,
yeah.
Ordovicians.
Ordovicians, yeah.
Yeah, Ordovicians. I've read a bit of that Scottish novelist who writes about Boudica or Boadicea, you know, the woman who united the disunited tribes of Britain against the Romans, you know. And this sort of begins at the time when the Roman Empire is now being piggybacked by Christianity, early Christianity. It becomes the Holy Roman Empire. But in fact, as with all human creations, it's a fairly unholy mess, you know. So there's a very, very strong depiction of the struggle, you could say the battle between ideas, with some ideas taking prominence and the others being completely extirpated by the most vicious means available sometimes. And there is an early scene when they get to somewhere in Germany and they're convening with a lot of other church figures at the court of the regional emperor of the Roman Empire. And there's a trial going on where an early Christian figure whose opinions are not, you know, universally adopted by the bishops in power at the time is brought to trial and found guilty and actually executed with several of his followers. I mean, so the battles weren't just abstract platonic battles of ideas on some ideal plane. They were vicious struggles with life and death outcomes, which kind of shocked me, really. And then for a while I thought, oh, I'm reading about the history of the early church. But we still live in a time when the ideas enshrined in certain religions still have a lot of power on a political level, you know, the politics of ideas. And so it started me thinking a lot about that very thing, you know, the politics of ideas, and that there, you know, we are still living in a context where there is a lot of ideological struggle going on, you know, and maybe because we're in the middle of it, like the lobster being cooked slowly, we don't realise what we're being cooked, what kind of soup we're being turned into. So it's good to sort of take a step back. I was surprised to be so stimulated by a book about an ancient figure who's almost disappeared from history. And it's brought me back into thinking about what things are like today. So I think I've raved on enough, except that I do want to say that as someone who's been struggling to write, I find David's writing really a delight. I mean, because he's been an editor, I suppose, he can edit himself, and his writing just flows with beautiful clarity and efficiency in a way. I mean, there's not a word out of place. And the effect of it is just to carry you along in the narrative so beautifully. There's an Italian word, I know it also exists in English, but I like saying it in Italian, called limpido. And David's prose is limpido. I hope prose is a masculine noun. So it's limpid, his prose is limpid as well, which makes it very easy to read. And there's a lot of research sort of hidden away between the lines. You don't realise the authority, that an author really needs authority to sort of woo you along to go on the journey with him or her. And David wields that authority with a great subtlety, and there's an intelligence interpenetrating the narrative in the way the prose and the narrative unfolds, that it's very winning. And the first time I read it, I hardly noticed that. And then the second time through, I'm really, really enjoying it as a piece of writing as well. So thank you all for coming to the launch of this book. Is this the first launch, David?
First launch.
The first launch of this book?
Of this one, oh yeah.
When I do a book, I launch it in as many possible places as I can con people into coming along to here. So it is a very clever device to set up a completely fictional character, what's his name?
Arwell.
Yeah. Arwell, which is the Welsh name. The boy who gets kidnapped ends up tagging along with Pelagius, and sort of poses as a fictional character, acts as the secretary and traces the journeys of Pelagius. You know, so Pelagius is slightly remote, but nicely realised. And Arwell comes to the fore, which is a lovely device. And David's also written this beautiful foreword, as though this manuscript written by Arwell, the secretary, has just been discovered, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he even gives a reference to a fictitious biblical journal, which I immediately went and tried to look up on Google, and it doesn't exist, because David's very clever. So it's a very effective device.